Hey guys, tonight, we're not just strolling through the romanticized lanes of medieval Europe. We're stepping into the reality behind those pilgrim tales you've probably heard. Because while pilgrimages promise spiritual reward, they also brought hardship, danger, and a test of willpower most of us can barely imagine. So before you settle in, take a second to like the video and subscribe only if this content truly interests you. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and how late it is. Now dim the lights, maybe find a cozy spot, and let's gently begin tonight's journey into the real struggles of the medieval road. The pilgrim who walked barefoot for months on stony roads. Imagine yourself at the edge of a medieval village just before dawn. The sky is still dark, washed with a faint blue that hints at the coming light. A soft wind rustles through the hedgerows. Birds have not yet begun their song. And on the narrow road that threads its way between fields and woods, a single figure moves slowly, deliberately barefoot. His name is not recorded. His journey left no chronicles, only whispered recollections in parish registers and perhaps a scribbled note in a priory's guest book. But men like him were once a common sight in medieval Europe. Pilgrims, devoted souls who walked vast distances across the continent, often with nothing more than a walking stick, a pouch of coarse bread and faith, worn thin like the soles of their feet. To walk barefoot on a pilgrimage was not required, but for some, it was the only way their prayer felt heard. Leather shoes were removed at the village boundary, set aside as a final comfort they would not permit themselves. The road was uneven, cobbled in some places, but more often packed dirt and gravel, rutted by wagon wheels and littered with the leavings of animals. Sharp pebbles dug into the skin, twigs and thorns snagged at every step. When it rained, the path turned to slippery mud. When it froze, it bit the toes with a silent, numbing cruelty. Yet for this pilgrim, each painful step was not a punishment. It was a promise, a penance, a silent offering exchanged for some hope of redemption. He may have begun his journey in the lowlands of Flanders or the rolling hills of Yorkshire. His destination? Perhaps Canterbury, or Compostela, or even the Holy Sepulchre, though few made it so far. For weeks, even months, he would travel along paths that wound through unfamiliar villages, quiet woods, and sunlit fields that blurred one into another. By day, he walked, the rhythm of his progress slow, deliberate, enduring. He leaned slightly to one side from a blister, favoring the foot until it hardened into a callus. His feet were often wrapped in linen rags to stave off infection or soften the touch of sharp stones. But even these would wear through within days. Locals might offer him broth or bread, or glance away, uneasy at his cracked heels and sunburned neck. By night, he slept where he could, under the overhang of a barn, in the corner of a churchyard, occasionally in the pilgrims' quarters of a monastery, if he was fortunate. The chill of evening air settled into his bones. Lice and gnats were unwelcome companions. But sleep, when it came, was deep, exhaustion's gift to the devout. Not all pilgrims walked for noble reasons. Some walked to fulfill a vow made in sickness. Others walked because they had sinned, and this was their offering. A nobleman might pay a servant to walk in his name, and others still, those with no land, no ties, walked because it was the only way to make meaning of their lives. For many, the act of walking became a kind of prayer. Step after step, mile after mile, they left behind not just towns and crossroads, but burdens they had carried silently for years. The world these pilgrims passed through was not quiet in the way we imagine today. The roads buzzed with rumors of plague, of bad harvests, of kings at war. A village might be full of gossip one week and empty the next. Markets were loud, full of clatter and calls, but a pilgrim did not linger too long in one place, and people began to ask questions. A stranger was always a source of unease. Yet there was also kindness. A woman might hand him an apple over a fence. A boy might walk beside him a while, asking questions, then vanish into the fields again. A priest might anoint his forehead and offer a blessing, his voice low and slow, like the toll of a distant bell. Along the way, the pilgrim would pass shrines, simple stone altars at crossroads, niches carved into roadside walls, each bearing a weathered carving or fading relic. He might pause, kneel, offer a whispered prayer, or light a tiny taper if he had one. These shrines were small oases of meaning, scattered like stepping stones toward the holy. Over time, the pilgrim changed. His face became thinner, lined not with age but exposure. His hair matted under his hood. His speech slowed, becoming more deliberate, and his feet, those torn and bleeding at the journey's start, toughened. The pain became a dull background presence, part of the rhythm of walking. And when it flared again, when a sharp stone struck the wrong place, he gritted his teeth and pressed onward. Turning back meant shame. Giving up meant the prayer remained incomplete. Medieval society was deeply familiar with pain, but it was not pain for its own sake that made this journey meaningful. It was the sacrifice of comfort, the willingness to suffer privately, without recognition. Pilgrims were not praised. Most went unnoticed. They walked in silence so that someone else might be spared, or so that their sins, real or imagined, might be forgiven. In some towns, records note the arrival of pilgrims as if counting shadows. A man barefoot from the north seen near a wayside inn. In others, no mention at all. And when they reached their destination, be it a relic, a cathedral, or a sacred spring, they did not celebrate. They knelt, they prayed, and then often they turned and began the walk home. For some, the return was easier, feet hardened and spirit lighter. For others, the way back was slower, more difficult, the body failing just as the heart had lifted. Some never made it. Pilgrimage routes are dotted with nameless graves, marked by stone or cross or memory. But in the rhythm of their walking, there was a kind of peace. One step, then another. The past behind, the goal ahead. The road itself became their world, their trial, their absolution. So now, imagine once more that you are walking. The sun is rising ahead, just cresting a hill. The light is soft, almost golden. The earth is damp with morning dew, and your feet find their way among the stones. There is no hurry, no audience, just the quiet progress of someone who chose to walk the hard road, and never stopped moving forward. And somewhere, in the silence of that morning path, the pilgrim continues still. End of script. 5,942 characters. Let me know if you'd like a thumbnail image prompt, SEO title, or a version focused on a different region or pilgrimage. The merchant's widow who slept in churchyards along the way. Imagine yourself walking alone beneath a pale sky, the road ahead quiet and long. The stones beneath your feet shift slightly with each step, and though the spring rains have passed, the ground is still damp along the edges. On your back, a bundle of cloth tied with twine, and in your pocket, a folded piece of wax paper containing a crust of bread that has gone just a little too hard. You are not lost, but you are not expected anywhere either. In the late 14th century, just after a wave of illness had carved silence into so many towns, a widow known in a few records only as Elena, wife of Ivo the merchant, left the market city of Norwich with no clear destination. Her husband had died in the spring of 1376, and his debts had died with him. But not the shame, not the suspicion, whispers in the stalls that the goods had been weighed light, that coins had vanished, that Ivo had not died of fever, but perhaps of fear. Whether the rumors were true or not, Elena faced the aftermath as so many widows did, alone, unsure, and suddenly outside the circle of trust that had once sheltered her. We do not have Elena's diary. There are no preserved letters, only fragments in local court ledgers. Her name struck from the rolls of tenancy, A brief note that her husband's stall was reclaimed by the city. Yet her story is not lost. It was quietly repeated, handed down through oral recollection in the villages she passed through. It was said she walked for months, stopping at parish boundaries, asking politely for bread or water, and offering small mending tasks in return. But most of all, she became known for where she chose to sleep. Not under hedgerows, not in barns or lean-tos, but beside the low stone walls of churches. In medieval England, churchyards were not yet closed off at night. Many had no iron gates, just wooden latches and winding paths of worn grass. The ground was uneven, dotted with lichen-covered stones, and perfumed by a mix of wild thyme, candle wax, and the faint scent of consecrated earth. Elena, like some others before her, believed that the presence of the sacred could offer a kind of protection, not only from thieves, but from the unseen forces that people believed wandered after dusk. Imagine lying down in a patch of moss beside the apse wall of a church, a stone still warm from the sun presses against your back. The hush is total. The night sounds, an owl's call, the sighing of wind across the chapel roof, blend into a kind of lullaby. This was how she slept, not always well, not always safe, but with a belief that the dead, buried beneath her, would not wish to see harm come to someone in sorrow. In many regions, churchyards were seen as thresholds, not quite of this world, not quite the next. Travelers who had lost their place in society often paused there. Some left tokens at graves, others carved marks in stone, simple signs that marked where they had rested. These were not formal rituals, but they were common enough to form a pattern. And Elena became part of that quiet, undocumented pattern. She is remembered not because she was remarkable in action, but because she persisted in the slow rhythm of survival. Rain made her fingers red and stiff. Hunger blurred her vision. Yet she kept walking, from Norwich toward the Midlands, eventually down through Wiltshire and into Devon, if the fragmented accounts are to be trusted. In one village, she helped mend altar linens. In another, she sat with a dying boy whose mother was too exhausted to hold him. There are no grand stories, no miracles, just kindnesses rendered in passing. Women like Elena often disappear from the historical record. They left little behind. No heirs, no property, no documents. But occasionally, something survives. A priest's marginal note in a record book mentions a widow who slept 3 nights among the stones. She said her dreams were quiet here. That line, buried in ink that has faded to brown, is one of the few direct hints of her presence. To walk alone as a woman in medieval England was not unheard of, but it was uncommon enough to draw attention. Guild laws forbade most women from trading independently, unless widowed, and even then, only under specific circumstances. With no stall, no backing, and no guild membership, Elena would not have been allowed to legally sell anything in most towns. So she bartered with labor, mending hems, sweeping thresholds, helping at candle-making stations. She moved slowly, often stopping for several days before continuing on. Not drifting, exactly, but never rooted. Churches, then, were not only places of worship, they were the heartbeat of village life. Beside their walls, decisions were made, alms were distributed, and gossip passed like wind through open doors. For someone like Elena, sleeping nearby meant catching a little warmth from that heartbeat. It meant being seen, if only as a shadow in the periphery. You might wonder why she never settled again, why she didn't stop walking and begin anew. But many who fell from the networks of trade and kinship in medieval society found it nearly impossible to re-enter. There were no social programs, no shelters. Hospitality was an act of charity, not policy. So some kept walking, not chasing a destination, but delaying the end of the road. By the time her path ends, perhaps in Exeter, perhaps somewhere less recorded, Elena would have walked nearly 300 miles. She likely owned only 2 sets of clothing and a small piece of cloth that had once been a shawl. Her final days are not known, but the impression she left is quiet and persistent. Her story helps us understand something broader: the fragility of belonging in the medieval world, how quickly one could fall from the center to the edge, and how, even then, people sought sanctuaries in overlooked places, in the curve of a chapel wall, in the stillness between gravestones, in the hush before dawn when the mist clung low over the grass. Not all pilgrims had shrines. Not all journeys sought miracles. Some simply hoped for peace, for safety, for one more morning with dry feet, and perhaps for one more night beneath a sky that forgave them. The farmer who carried a heavy iron chain around his neck. Imagine walking along a country path in early spring. The air is still cool, the grass wet with last night's mist, and the trees are just beginning to bud. A man is ahead of you, trudging slowly, head bowed. Around his neck hangs a thick iron chain, its weight pressing grooves into his skin and shoulders. It clinks gently with every step, a metallic reminder of something unseen. The villagers say each link represents a sin, and he bears them all. In parts of medieval Europe, especially in the late Middle Ages, public penance was a deeply personal, yet socially visible act. It wasn't just a confession whispered in a chapel. It could become a lifetime of quiet punishment, worn in plain sight. This farmer, whose name, if ever recorded, is long lost to the ages, may not have been alone in choosing to wear his repentance like a yoke. We don't know the precise nature of his misdeeds, but in that era, remorse could be as physical as it was spiritual. Penance chains were not a widespread norm, but they did appear in certain corners of Christian Europe, particularly among those who believed their soul required visible humiliation to find peace. These chains were rarely imposed by clergy. Instead, they were self-administered or chosen under the quiet guidance of a confessor. Pilgrims might carry stones on their backs, crawl on their knees, or, like this man, wear iron links around their necks for weeks, months, even years. It was a way to live with sin without hiding it, reminding others, and perhaps reminding God, that forgiveness was still being sought. If you lived in his village, you might have seen him at the edge of fields, hunched over, tilling the soil with careful rhythm. The chain never left his body, not even in sleep. Some say he looped it around the wooden frame of his bed at night to keep it from sliding off. Others recall how he once fainted at the church steps during a hot summer vigil, the metal heated by the sun, burning his skin. He never asked for help, but neither did he refuse it. Daily life in such a village followed a rhythm older than memory. Dawn brought roosters and the scent of smoldering peat. Bread ovens warmed early, and children chased geese through the muddy lanes. But there was always someone like him, someone who chose hardship that no one else demanded. Quietly, without fanfare, he became a part of the town's landscape. His presence made others reflect. His burden reminded them of theirs. And yet, there was gentleness too. Neighbors sometimes left bread near his door without speaking. Children, in secret defiance of their parents' warnings, tried to count the chain's links when he knelt in the chapel. Some believed he was cursed. Others thought he was closer to the divine than any priest. There are occasional mentions in local church records, brief, sparse notes written by tired clerks who did not deem his story remarkable. A man of chains visited the shrine again, left a token of iron at the altar. These entries often sit between more ordinary mentions. Lists of lentil tithes, complaints about harvest yields, names of the newly born and the recently buried. Archaeologically, traces of such penitential practices rarely survive. Chains rust, documents fade, and humility leaves no monument. But oral traditions, parish legends, and travelers' letters occasionally preserve glimpses. A 14th century monk in Aragon wrote about a man who wore a neck chain so long that his spine curved under its burden. Another tale from Normandy spoke of a widow who fasted in silence for 10 years, believing speech itself to be a sin she had once abused. The cultural logic behind these acts was grounded in a medieval understanding of the body and soul as deeply interconnected. Pain was not merely endured. It was believed to carve space for redemption. The body, through suffering, could reshape the spirit. Whether a person had broken a vow, abandoned a child, stolen during famine, or merely believed themselves impure, it wasn't uncommon to see sorrow made physical. Still, not all responses were kind. Superstition often painted penitents as harbingers of misfortune. When cattle grew ill or a storm drowned the barley crop, some whispered that the chain-wearer had angered higher powers and now drew bad luck toward the village like a lodestone. But few dared confront him. He neither fought nor fled. His reply, if spoken, was probably the same every time. "It is mine to carry." As the years passed, the farmer aged more quickly than his neighbors. Iron does not grow lighter with time, and shoulders do not grow stronger in old age. He eventually had to be lifted to his knees by others, his hands trembling as he tried to tie his boots. Still, he refused to remove the chain. Even when his ribs showed through his tunic, and the local priest quietly suggested easing his burden, he only shook his head. No record tells us when he died. It may have been in winter, after a fever swept the valley, or in summer, quietly, beneath a tree, while resting from the sun. But those who tended to his burial said they left the chain on him. They wrapped it around his chest and neck, gently, and laid him in the soil with both weight and grace. In that final silence, no one questioned whether he had earned peace. The burden had already been paid. There's something oddly comforting in such stories, not for the suffering, but for the stillness they leave behind. A man, once broken by regret, became a fixture of his time. A quiet echo of faith and frailty, visible only to those who looked closely. His chain, once clinking through the streets, now rests with him beneath the roots. And so, another figure from a half-remembered past slips into memory. Neither saint nor sinner, just a farmer who walked on stony paths with iron draped over his shoulders, and never let it go. The young woman who trusted Waymarks and lost her path. Imagine standing at a weather-worn crossroads in a misty valley. The air smells of wet bark and moss, and the silence is broken only by the distant creak of tree limbs. Ahead, a hand-carved post juts from the earth, its arrows worn smooth by rain and time. One points towards Sanctum, another toward Rilford, and another is too faded to read. A young woman studies the signs, her bundle of provisions tied tightly to her back. She chooses the left path, trusting the etched name and the sun's soft angle. But the left path was never meant for pilgrims. Our story begins not with grand deeds, but with a quiet decision made in solitude. She had left her village just past midsummer, as the days began to shorten. Like many of her time, she traveled on foot, without maps, relying on memory, hearsay, and the rough markers left by others. Some waymarks were carved into trees, others into stones. A few were painted, though weather often stripped them bare within weeks. Most travelers knew not to trust a single sign, but she had been told the route was simple. Keep the sun to your left in the morning, and look for the blackthorn tree near the bend. But weather changes, and so does the light. On the second day, clouds gathered. By the third, fog had settled thick between the trees, making everything seem further than it was. Even sound felt distant. Her boots, once new, were soon heavy with damp soil. Food, bread, and dried apples lasted until the 5th day. After that, she rationed a small pouch of lentils and a few bitter greens she gathered near a stream. She was not the only one who ever lost her way. In medieval Europe, the pilgrim roads were dense with stories of those who wandered astray. The Codex Calixtinus, a 12th century guidebook for pilgrims heading to Santiago de Compostela, warned of false trails, wild dogs, and dishonest hosts. But what it could not warn of were the quieter dangers. The slow fading of direction, the erosion of landmarks, the misread angle of a path at twilight. Women often traveled in groups, especially if their journey was long. Bandits and lonely roads posed real threats. But some, like this young woman, believed solitude could bring clarity. They sought not only shrines but silence. It was said that the further one walked, the clearer one's soul became. Scraped clean by hardship, smoothed by repetition, purified by pain. By the time she realized her mistake, she had already passed beyond the range of return. Each day brought her further from certainty. The trees changed subtly, less oak, more pine. The soil darkened. The birds were no longer ones she recognized. And still, she pressed on, believing the sanctuary must lie just over the next ridge. In many medieval valleys, villages were set apart not just by miles, but by belief. One might celebrate a local saint who was unknown 2 hills over. One might bless the crops on Lammas, while another observed the feast of Saint Bega. The names of places changed as well. Rilford might once have been called Redmere, and Sanctum could refer to a small chapel no longer standing. Even today, scholars attempting to map ancient pilgrim routes find that paths splinter, fade, and contradict one another. Eventually, hunger became a slow fog in her mind. Her body grew quiet with it. Movements dulled, thoughts softened. She drank from any stream that looked clear. At night, she curled against trees, using her shawl to trap some warmth. No one knew where she was. No bells tolled nearby. No human voices echoed. Only once did she pass a shepherd's hut, long abandoned, its roof half collapsed and moss growing over the stones. She spent the night inside, too cold to sleep. And then, one morning, she heard something familiar. The creak of a cart wheel. Not close, but not far. She followed the sound with slow steps, emerging from a stand of pine into open field. A dirt track wound through the grass, leading toward what looked like smoke, thin, gray, and steady. She followed it until the walls of a small village came into view. It was not a holy site. It had no relics, no shrines, no famous altar. It was simply a farming hamlet with a chapel, a well, and a few dozen thatched roofs. They found her sitting by the well, her lips chapped, her eyes downcast. She had no story to offer except that she had followed the sign. The carved post, she insisted, had pointed toward a place of refuge. It had, she now knew, pointed wrong. In that era, stories of misdirection were passed quietly from hearth to hearth. Waymarks were not regulated. One man might carve a symbol to help travelers. Another might move it as a joke. Roads forked unexpectedly. Whole routes could shift when a bridge collapsed or a trail flooded. In some places, locals deliberately redirected strangers to protect their own paths or resources. One chronicler described villages that turned away pilgrims entirely, afraid that too many guests would sour the well or anger the local spirits. Still, the young woman stayed in that village for several weeks. The locals offered her food and a place to rest. She helped gather firewood and learned their prayers. When she finally left, it was late autumn. This time, she did not travel alone. A farmer headed in the same direction agreed to walk with her as far as the river crossing. He had made the journey before. He knew which trees to follow, which markers were honest. It's easy to think of medieval people as perpetually lost in a world without maps, but they were not. They knew their land through memory, repetition, and slow accumulation. They sang landmarks into their songs. They marked distances by footsteps and hours, not miles. But for those who strayed beyond the familiar, who crossed into new regions or trusted a single signpost too deeply, loss was not uncommon. She did eventually reach the shrine she'd set out to find. When she arrived, The warden asked how long she had walked. She could not answer. Time had blurred. She no longer knew the number of days. And so she prayed, not just in thanks, but in quiet recognition of everything she had passed through. The wrong path had changed her. She had trusted the Waymarks. They had failed her, but the land had not. It had carried her, slowly, awkwardly, patiently, to another place. And sometimes, even the wrong path leads somewhere sacred. The Guildsman who ate only bread and water as a vow. Imagine a man walking slowly along a dirt road, shoulders slightly hunched, lips cracked with dryness, a small cloth bundle pressed to his chest. Dust clings to his boots. The sun overhead is not yet harsh, but already he squints as though it were noon. Each step forward is deliberate, paced not by rhythm or urgency, but by necessity. He has made a vow, not of silence, nor chastity, but of hunger. Only bread, only water, until he reaches the relics. He was a guildsman, not of high rank nor poor, but somewhere in the layered middle of a medieval town's working class. He may have been a cooper, or a tanner, or perhaps a weaver. His craft was respected, though not exceptional. But in his mind, he owed a debt, not to another man, but to the divine. A vow of self-denial was his offering, one he hoped would tip the scales of fate in his favor. Vows like his were not uncommon in the medieval world. People from all walks of life, nobles, farmers, tradesmen, believed that hardship undertaken voluntarily might bring favor from the heavens. These were often tied to pilgrimage. Some vowed to crawl part of the way to a shrine. Others walked barefoot across sharp gravel. This man, whose name we do not know, chose to strip his diet down to the barest sustenance. Only bread, only water. Not for a day, not for a week, but for the entire journey. Bread, of course, was a staple, but not all bread was alike. In wealthier homes, bread was white and soft, made from fine ground wheat flour. Among guild workers, it was darker, coarse, dense, often baked with rye or barley, and sometimes stretched with ground peas or beans when times were lean. The crusts could be nearly as hard as stone, the interior dry and tough. Water, when drawn from a good well, was clean enough, but the taste of it grew thin and metallic after days of nothing else. He would have begun his journey with some optimism. The bread packed tightly in a satchel, the skin of water heavy but full. The mornings would have been manageable, cool and still. The path might have taken him past fields where oxen plodded and larks circled lazily in the air. But by the third day, perhaps sooner, his body would have begun to complain. Guild work required strength, and his hands were used to steady meals. Thick soups, stewed onions, warm ale. Without salt, without fat, without variety. His limbs began to feel like they no longer belonged to him. The journey may have lasted a fortnight, or longer. Medieval travel was slow. Roads were uneven, and distances deceptive. A single ruined bridge could delay a traveler for days. Inns were sparse, and not always welcoming to a solitary walker, who could offer only a coin or two. He likely slept in barns, churchyards, or beneath hedges, keeping his bread close to avoid the mice. If he passed through towns, he avoided temptation. The smell of roasting meat, the warmth of communal alehouses, the generosity of strangers offering food. To break the vow, even in kindness, would mean starting over. Pilgrimages in this era were often undertaken to reach relics, bones of saints, fragments of the true cross, or even cloth believed to bear the imprint of holy events. His destination may have been Walsingham, or Canterbury, or even Santiago, though the latter would have been a rare and monumental undertaking for a man of his station. Regardless, the belief was the same, that proximity to sacred objects could bring healing, redemption, or peace. As the days wore on, his body grew slower. Blisters on his feet refused to close. His vision blurred. Not from disease, but from the steady depletion of energy. Bread crumbled too easily in his shaking hands. Water barely slaked the ache in his throat. Still he continued. To turn back would have been not only shameful, but spiritually ruinous. What might he have thought as he trudged into the outskirts of his destination? Perhaps the relief was muted by exhaustion. The sight of familiar spires or distant bells might have felt unreal, as though part of a dream he could not quite grasp. At the gates, he may have paused, not out of reverence, but because his legs refused to carry him further. A monk or lay brother might have come to help him inside. When he finally stood before the relics, we cannot know what he felt. Triumph, perhaps, or confusion. Sometimes the divine feels furthest when it is finally within reach. He may have wept, or merely stared, not because he did not care, but because his body had no strength left to express what moved in his mind. Such stories rarely leave behind names. No scroll recorded his passage. No local chronicler etched his hardships into parchment. But men like him were not rare. The medieval world was full of quiet promises. Vows made in the shadow of illness, or guilt, or hope. Some were fulfilled, others forgotten, but each shaped a life, however briefly. Guilds themselves were communities built on vows of a different kind, of mutual aid, of craftsmanship, of honor in one's labor. A guildsman knew what it meant to commit, to endure, and to offer effort without immediate reward. In many ways, this vow of bread and water was an extension of that ethos, rigid, disciplined, and silently proud. You can imagine him resting in the nave of a great church, the air thick with incense, the stone floor cold beneath his body. Around him, candles flicker softly. Other pilgrims kneel or whisper prayers. But he is silent, still holding the same satchel he left home with, now empty and stained. In the hush of that holy space, his journey ended not with applause or recognition, but with a slow return to breath and stillness. Later, he may have returned home, or remained near the shrine, having given so much of himself that going back seemed impossible. Bread and water were no longer enough, but they had carried him across distance, doubt, and deprivation. And in that, there was something sacred. Let the rhythm of his footsteps fade softly into the distance now. Let the silence of his vow settle in the background. There were thousands like him, in quiet corners of history, walking roads with nothing but belief and bread between them and the unknown. The pilgrim who fell ill and was left at a roadside shrine. Imagine a quiet, overgrown path on the edge of a damp forest. The canopy filters the light into pale greens and grays, and the sound of birdsong carries faintly between the trees. The air smells of moss and old wood. Along this path, not far from a bend where the road disappears into shadow, stands a modest wooden shrine. A simple structure, weathered, a cross nailed to its frame, a niche carved into the post, holding a faded icon and the melted stumps of old candles. And beside it, motionless on a bed of packed earth, lies a man. He is dressed like any other pilgrim. Plain woolen robe, a satchel once full of bread and dried fruit, a walking stick just within reach. But unlike others, he is not moving. His eyes are closed. His breath is shallow. For 3 days, he lies there, wrapped in fever, half-conscious, left behind not from cruelty, but necessity. Such moments were not uncommon on medieval pilgrimage routes. These journeys could span hundreds of miles, often on foot, across regions where medical help was limited and illness was both feared and misunderstood. Companions walked together for protection and for prayer, but when one fell too far behind, choices had to be made. To stop for too long risked the entire group. Delays meant fewer alms, fewer places to sleep, more exposure to illness themselves. And so, when this man collapsed along the road, they carried him as far as they could manage. When the weight became too much, They looked for a place with some meaning, a place where death, should it come, would feel less like abandonment and more like a passing into something sacred. The shrine was not grand. Perhaps it marked the site of a past miracle, or maybe it had simply stood there for so long that the local people believed it blessed the very earth beneath it. Either way, it was considered a fitting place to wait. His companions laid him there gently, placing a few coins in the niche, enough for prayers should someone find him, and whispered blessings in Latin and in their native tongue. Then, after a moment of quiet hesitation, they turned and continued down the road. For 3 days, the man remained. We do not know what thoughts passed through his mind, if he was aware of his surroundings or lost to fevered dreams. But what is more certain is this: he was not entirely alone. Roadside shrines held a particular kind of presence. Travelers paused there, whether out of reverence, routine, or superstition. And those who passed this way would have seen the figure lying in the grass. Some would have offered a prayer, standing at a distance. Others might have left a crust of bread, or a folded blanket if they had one to spare. Most said nothing. Silence was the most common gift, a kind of quiet acknowledgement of suffering too familiar to name. To be left behind was one of the great fears of any pilgrim. The road was long, the terrain unfamiliar, and those who could not keep pace risked being forgotten. But there was also a strange comfort in being left at a shrine. The very act of stopping at such a place meant that others, too, would stop, if not to help, then to bear witness. The man may have improved. Fevers often came and went. He might have woken on the second day and taken a few sips of water left in a clay bowl. Or he may have drifted deeper, his body too weak to recover. In either case, his story would have been shared quietly by those who passed. Some would carry word of him to the next village. Others would tell monks at a nearby abbey. And in time, perhaps, a brother would come to retrieve the body, or to find him sitting upright, hungry but alive. Shrines like these were never merely wood and stone. They were places where the physical world and the spiritual one met, where footsteps slowed, where time, for a moment, felt like it thinned. They marked not just crossroads of geography, but of human experience, places where joy and grief, survival and surrender, often stood side by side. The man's companions likely thought of him in the days that followed. Perhaps they asked for his name to be recorded in the prayer rolls at their destination. Or perhaps they walked in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, unsure if they'd made the right choice. Guilt was a common burden among pilgrims, often heavier than the pack on their backs. When describing medieval life, it is easy to focus on castles and kings, on the sweep of armies and the clang of swords. But most lives were lived in the quiet margins, in huts on farms, in long walks through changing weather. And many of the most human moments happened not in triumph, but in the uncertainty of waiting, in a man lying fevered beside a shrine, and in the quiet kindness of strangers who did not know his name, but paused anyway. There are few records of what happened to such pilgrims. Death, when it came, was often unremarked. A local priest might bury the body nearby, mark the place with a stone, and recite the same prayers he had said 100 times before. Or the man might recover, rise, and walk once more down the road, his limbs stiff, his pace slower, but his path resumed. In either case, the shrine remained. It stood for years. Moss climbed its base. Birds nested in the eaves. Travelers continued to stop, still whispering blessings. Some said they could feel a presence there, a kind of warmth in the air, a hush that encouraged silence, as though the ground remembered the ones who had lain there, and held their stories in the grain of the wood. So now, if you imagine that path once more, the cool earth, the filtered light, the steady creak of branches, you might also imagine that shrine, and beside it, the faint impression of a man long gone, his name unknown, his prayer unfinished, but not forgotten. And in that image, perhaps, you find not just history, but something quieter. Something that lingers, like the hush before a bell rings, or the memory of a footstep on an old road. The old man who gave his shoes to a stranger in need. Imagine yourself walking along a narrow path at the edge of a frost-covered field. The ground is uneven beneath your soles, softened by thaw, but still cold enough to sting. A faint mist clings low to the hedgerows, and the sky holds that pale, colorless hue common to early winter mornings. You pass an old man moving slowly, his feet bare, mottled with dirt, his step careful but not hesitant. He nods to you gently, without a word, and continues on his way. This was how many remembered him. Not as a beggar, not as a saint, but as a figure that quietly unsettled and comforted in equal measure. No one quite knew where he came from, but everyone seemed to agree on what he had done. In a small hamlet outside the market town of Lavenham, sometime around the early 15th century, an elderly man, possibly a weaver or once a clerk, gave his only pair of shoes to a stranger passing through. The act was not recorded in any official register. It lived on in the stories told by those who watched it happen, or who heard it whispered on cold evenings near the hearth. Shoes in that time were not easily replaced. They were expensive to make, often cobbled from heavy leather and stitched by hand. For the poor, a single pair might last years and be passed down. For the elderly, whose feet had grown swollen and brittle with age, the shoes were often custom-altered or padded with wool to ease walking. So when the old man slipped them from his feet and pressed them into the hands of a barefoot traveler, people noticed. The man who received them was said to be from the north, thin, with dark rings under his eyes and an awkward gait, likely from weeks walking with no protection. He thanked the old man with tears in his eyes and vanished into the woods. The giver, however, remained. He did not ask for replacements. He did not go to the parish for help. Instead, he resumed his quiet rhythm, barefoot, even as the days grew colder. Why he did it, no one could say for certain. He never explained himself. He was not part of a monastic order, nor did he wear the symbols of a religious penitent. He attended Mass quietly, sat alone at the back, and sometimes mended fishing nets or carried sacks for others when his joints allowed. His name may have been Tomas or Edmund. It varies depending on the source. Each winter after that first act, villagers saw him walking the frost-bitten roads with bare feet, leaving faint impressions on the dirt and gravel. Children were at first frightened, then fascinated. Some imitated him in play, tiptoeing across stone paths until their mothers called them in. Adults remained unsure. Some saw his behavior as madness, others as holiness. A few suspected quiet punishment. But the man did not seek attention. He asked for nothing, and when offered shoes again, he would smile and shake his head. He was not immune to pain. In colder months, his gait slowed. He often warmed his feet near the communal oven, or rested them in sunlit patches along the church wall. When frostbitten skin began to crack, he would bind his feet in linen strips torn from his old shirts. He walked not out of stubbornness, but in silent commitment to a choice he had made, a kindness he had refused to undo. In medieval England, stories like this took root easily. Lives were filled with hardship, yes, but also with rituals of quiet generosity. It was a world of obligations and exchanges, of almsgiving and barter, but also of gestures that defied explanation. The man who gave his shoes became a kind of moral mirror. Those who passed him felt their own choices briefly weighed. Imagine the village itself. Thatched roofs blackened with soot, low stone fences, fields misted in morning fog. In such a place, memory was carried by word of mouth. Local priests might reference the old man during sermons, not with praise or judgment, but as a reminder. Bakers sometimes left him crusts near the chapel door. One midwife is said to have offered him wool wrappings after her deliveries, and he accepted briefly during the deepest snow before returning to his bare steps again come spring. There is no record of his death. Like many in rural England, he likely passed quietly, his grave unmarked, folded into the churchyard with others whose names wore away long ago. But the shape of his story lingered. It reveals much about how medieval communities navigated morality. Not always with grand declarations, but with lived example. The concept of caritas, charity, was central, but not always transactional. Sometimes, it meant choosing hardship for oneself when comfort was rare. Sometimes, it meant remaining in that hardship long after the moment of generosity had passed. What made his story last wasn't the act itself. It was the fact that he never took it back. That every step thereafter became part of the offering. The shoes were not the gift. The walk was. In the years since, the tale has been told in slightly different forms. A few say the man was once wealthy. Others insist he was a monk who left the cloister. Still others claim he spoke to no one at all. A silent figure who appeared after a flood and vanished before the next. But always the shoes, the bare feet, and the quiet sorrow remain. You can imagine his face. Deeply lined, pale from the cold, with eyes that carried something quiet and unshakable. Those who met him described his expression as both serene and sorrowful. Like someone who had long since made peace with pain, yet still carried its echo. That combination of peace and ache is not easy to find, and perhaps that is why people remembered him. Not because he was loud, not because he led or wrote or ruled, but because in a world that often demanded self-preservation, he chose otherwise, and kept choosing step after step. And so his story continues to walk beside us. The pilgrim who crossed a war-torn border at dawn. Imagine walking at first light, when the earth is still wet with night and the wind carries no sound. You step carefully, your breath visible in the cool air. The road before you is broken, half swallowed by weeds. Alongside it lie remnants of wagons, wheels snapped, axles splintered, the wood swollen from rain. A pair of boots mismatched sit neatly beside a crumpled woolen cloak. No one is around, but everything suggests that someone once was. He was a pilgrim, like many in that age. One of thousands who walked for penance, for healing, or simply because they believed they must. The route he followed led him along the edges of territories in dispute. For decades, this region had seen unrest, shifting loyalties, minor sieges, and burned-out farms. By the time he arrived at its border, the conflict had settled into something quieter, but no less dangerous. Patrols moved irregularly. Villages stood half-abandoned. Trust, where it existed, lived only between kin. Most avoided this crossing. The shrine he sought could be reached another way, though it would take weeks longer. But he had little coin, and even less time. Winter was drawing near, and so he waited until the moon began to fade, then set out across the contested plain, hoping, as many before him had done, that dawn would be his ally. It was not uncommon for pilgrims to cross into uncertain lands. Medieval Europe was a patchwork of fiefdoms and borderlands, each with its own tolls, rules, and watchful eyes. A single road might pass through 5 languages in as many days. Some borders were marked by rivers or stone cairns. Others were invisible but no less real, remembered in songs, skirmishes, and whispered warnings. Our pilgrim carried little. Only a cloth pack with bread, cheese rind, and a small wooden icon. His staff was worn smooth by miles of use. He kept to the edge of the path, avoiding the deepest mud, passing burnt-out houses with hollow windows. Once, he saw a child's doll in a ditch, its cloth body damp and sagging. There were no crows, no birdsong, just the soft scrape of his footsteps. In times of war, even silence can be unsettling. Fields once filled with wheat, or rye now lay fallow. Fences had fallen. Orchards had been stripped. The wind carried no scent of cooking fires. Only the faint mineral smell of damp earth and old ash. But it was not just the landscape that had changed. People, too, were different in such places. A traveler might pass a hamlet where shutters never opened, where no one returned a greeting. Not out of hostility, but out of fear. In war-touched regions, even kindness could be mistaken for betrayal. He crossed through quietly, following a stream for orientation. Just before the sun rose, he reached what once had been a checkpoint. A simple timber gate, broken now, its hinges hanging askew. It had not been used in months. A rusted helmet lay in the grass beside it. On the other side, the land began to rise gently into wooded hills. He did not run. He did not hurry. Each step was deliberate. That was the only way, really. 1 foot after the other, slowly enough not to seem like fleeing, quickly enough not to linger. At one point, he paused to drink from the stream. The water was cold and sharp, and he let it sit in his mouth a moment before swallowing. No one stopped him. No one called out. And still, he felt eyes watching. Perhaps not real ones, but the echo of choices made by others who had walked here before him. Some had made it through. Some had not. Their presence clung faintly to the roadside. Old sandals tied to a tree, a broken string of prayer beads scattered in the grass. In medieval pilgrimage, the destination mattered less than the journey itself. Many pilgrims never reached their intended shrines. Others changed their goals along the way. A vow to visit Rome might shift to a quiet chapel a few days closer. In times of conflict, practicality often tempered devotion. But for those who continued, through danger, fatigue, or fear, their walk became a kind of inward crossing, a transformation shaped not just by faith, but by endurance. By midday, he reached a village just beyond the hills. The people there were cautious, but not unkind. They gave him a seat near the hearth and a bowl of stew. When he asked about the shrine, they nodded and pointed him north. It was still 5 days away. He thanked them, but said little else. He never spoke much about the crossing. In the years after, when people asked about the journey, he would only say that he had passed through at dawn, and that it was quiet. But in private moments, in prayer, in reflection, he returned to that morning. The stillness of the ruined fields, the cloaks abandoned on fence posts, the road broken but passable, because sometimes the places we cross silently leave the deepest marks. And though war had not touched him directly, it had shaped the ground beneath his feet. That memory remained. A quiet border, a vanished patrol, and a path walked alone while the rest of the world slept. The pilgrims who quarreled over a single loaf of bread. Imagine yourself walking beside others under a pale sky, your boots softened with dust, your breath light from hours of quiet marching. The rhythm of your steps once matched theirs. You shared stories. You shared silence. You even shared sore feet and cold rain. But now, something has shifted. A silence has grown that no joke will smooth. It began, like so many human troubles, with something simple: bread. They were pilgrims. Perhaps 5 of them. Perhaps more. Men and women from different towns who had joined paths on the road to a shrine. In the medieval world, pilgrimage was one of the few shared acts that could unite strangers. Some walked to fulfill a vow. Others sought forgiveness, healing, or simply the hope that something sacred might still touch their lives. Along the way, fellow pilgrims often became companions in the truest sense, sharing their provisions, their prayers, and sometimes their only dry cloak. But hunger does not honor friendship, and even among the devout, the need to eat has a weight that slowly presses patience into dust. The road was long, and the towns between were few. By evening, their supplies had thinned to almost nothing, except for 1 half loaf, a rounded end of coarse barley bread wrapped in linen and drawn from a pack with quiet ceremony. The bread was not much, coarse and dry, speckled with fragments of husk. It had likely been baked days earlier, and its crust had hardened to something between wood and stone. But hunger alters perception. In the flickering firelight of that shared evening, the loaf became more than food. It became fairness. It became memory. It became everything that had not gone to plan. The argument began softly, as so many do. A suggestion, a reminder of who had last eaten. A voice raised a little too quickly. Another cutting in. The group's balance, so recently built on shared hardship, tipped. Accusations followed. Someone recalled how another had taken more dried figs 3 nights ago. Someone else noted how one pair of boots never left the firewood gathering. These were not new grievances, only freshly voiced. By the time the bread was broken, so was the fellowship. Pilgrimage was never meant to be easy. In medieval Europe, pilgrims could travel for weeks, sometimes months, sleeping in church porches or stables, accepting what charity they found along the way. Some carried letters of passage or badges to show their intent. Others went entirely on faith. Provisions were always uncertain. Inns were expensive. Water could be scarce. Illness was common. And under these conditions, even the smallest injustice could feel enormous. It's tempting to think that those who walked for religious reasons were immune to petty quarrels. But history shows otherwise. Records from shrines tell of thefts, arguments, even brawls among those who had set out with pious intentions. One account from the shrine of St. Thomas in Canterbury mentions a dispute over sleeping space that ended in bruises and excommunication. The road tests not only the body, but the heart. In this case, there were no blows, only words. But sometimes words leave the deeper wound. The fire was allowed to die low. Packs were gathered in silence. And before dawn, the group split. Not by vote, not by discussion, but by instinct. Each stepped onto a different fork of the road, as if their paths had never truly been shared. One might imagine that they later regretted it. Or perhaps not. Some wounds settle into the body and make quiet homes. They might have passed each other again, days or weeks later, near a shrine or in a queue for a healer's touch, but turned their faces away. Bitterness has a weight unlike any pack, and it is rarely lifted all at once. Still, even in this moment of rupture, the setting remained unchanged. The hedges still held their due. The chapel bells still rang in the distance. Birds stirred the early light. And the pilgrimage continued, as it always does, onward, with or without reconciliation. It's worth noting that food held sacred meaning in medieval life. The act of sharing a loaf was not only practical, but symbolic. Bread was tied to community, to the divine, to the idea of sustenance offered in trust. Breaking bread with someone was not just feeding the body, but affirming a relationship. To fight over it, then, struck a nerve deeper than simple appetite. In some guilds, the communal table was central to rituals of welcome and farewell. Monasteries too kept careful accounts of who received bread and how much. Even the poorest village understood that bread was not just a meal. It was dignity, mercy, and structure. To divide it unevenly was not merely stingy. It was unjust. Imagine one of the pilgrims walking alone now, the loaf forgotten, the dispute echoing faintly in his mind. The road feels longer. The sounds feel sharper in the absence of voices. He eats whatever remains in his pack, but the food tastes thin. The companionship is missed, though pride prevents any turning back. History rarely records such moments. No chronicler scribbled their quarrel in the margin of a monastery ledger. No poem was written about the broken fellowship near a forked road. But these moments mattered because they were common. Quiet partings, silent resentments, Promises dropped like stones by the side of the road. The pilgrim's journey was never only toward a shrine. It was toward understanding, and sometimes toward failure. Even so, the shrine remained, and perhaps that was enough. Perhaps, after a few days of walking alone, each one found comfort in the same candlelit space, whispered the same prayers, and knelt before the same relics with the same hollow ache. The bread, the quarrel, the lost connection. They all faded slightly beneath the scent of incense and the sound of liturgy. Friendships might not have mended, but they had existed for a time. And like bread, they fed the journey as long as they lasted. Let the fire go out now. Let the voices soften into silence. Not every road ends in reunion. Some are simply walked, mile after mile, until bitterness grows light, and the heart remembers why it left home in the first place. The woman who trusted a map that omitted a river. Imagine a woman alone on a dirt path, hemmed in by leafless hedges and the last rustling sighs of early autumn. Her shoes are worn thin. One hand holds a stick for balance. The other cradles a cloth-wrapped bundle. Food, perhaps, or linens for trade. Pinned to her sleeve with a bone brooch is a folded sheet of parchment, curled at the corners and smudged from many readings. It is a map. The map is not a precise tool by today's standards. It is not drawn to scale. It bears no compass rose, and the place names are written in uncertain ink. But it is what she has. It was given to her by a merchant's widow who had once made the journey south, and it shows a path threading through forests and meadows, past shrines, and into distant villages. Yet it omits one crucial detail. The river. It's not marked. Not even a thin blue line. Whether it was forgotten, unknown, or simply deemed too minor to note, no one can say. But when she comes upon it, she does not meet it with surprise. She meets it with quiet disbelief, staring at the rushing water as though it has no right to be there. She looks up and down the bank. No bridge, no ferry, no sign of human crossing, only the sound of water moving over stones, the river swollen from recent rains, its edges choked with reeds and slippery clay. The woman kneels to test the current. It is strong, cold. Her map says she must cross here. Though in truth, the map says nothing at all. It merely points forward, as though the world beyond the paper will obey its ink. But the river cares nothing for parchment. Still she steps in. This moment, unwritten in any record, echoes with a kind of quiet courage. She is not a saint or a soldier. She is not remembered by name. But she is one of many ordinary travelers in medieval Europe who relied on maps that were half memory, half myth, drawn by those who walked once and guessed the rest. Maps in this era were treasured, but they were not reliable. Some were copied from memory around kitchen fires. Others were bought from passing scribes for a handful of coins, filled with fanciful beasts and winding roads that bore no resemblance to reality. Rivers moved with the seasons. Paths disappeared under bramble, or were rerouted by landlords. The land was a living thing, and ink could never keep pace. She holds her bundle above her head as the water reaches her waist, then her ribs. Her skirt clings, dragging her steps. The current is not violent, but steady. And steady water is often more dangerous than it seems. Her feet slip. For a moment, she vanishes from the bank entirely. But she does not cry out. She does not call for help. No one would hear her. After what feels like hours, though it was likely only moments, she pulls herself onto the far bank. Breathless, wet, the bundle is soaked through, its contents ruined. Bread dissolving, fabric sodden. The map itself is nearly torn in two, its ink running in long gray trails. And yet, she made it across. To travel alone in medieval times was rare for a woman, but not unheard of. Widows, spinners, healers, and women seeking sanctuary often moved between towns and monasteries with only local gossip or half-remembered trails to guide them. They trusted instinct, rumor, and scraps of advice handed to them in passing. There were no signposts nailed to trees, no distance markers, no lanterns to light the road. What knowledge existed lived in the minds of those who had been there before, or in maps like hers, fading more each day. The river, for its part, did not intend harm. It was simply there, a reminder that medieval travel was never linear. A promised route could vanish into thicket, or floodplain, or war. A shrine marked as standing might have burned. A village listed as thriving might be abandoned. The world shifted under your feet as you walked. And so, when the woman stood again and wrung out her sleeves, it was not just a physical task. It was an act of acceptance, the realization that the map was no longer a guide, but a relic. From here on, she would go by feel, by watching the light on the trees, by asking strangers, by trusting the sound of hooves or bells in the distance. This is the quieter history we often forget, not of kingdoms or conquests, but of someone soaked to the bone on a riverbank, catching her breath, deciding to keep going. She may have arrived at her destination days later than planned. Or perhaps she chose a different path entirely. She may have stopped to dry her clothes at a monastery, or been offered shelter in a thatched farmhouse along the road. Her story likely ends in obscurity, but her decision to wade in remains quietly profound. Because to trust a flawed map is not always foolish. Sometimes it is the only way to move forward, the only choice when the road ends, and a river rises to meet you. Sometimes the map leads you astray, and still you follow. Not for the promise of accuracy, but for the hope that somewhere beyond the ink lies a world you can endure. So now, if you imagine her once more, standing on the far bank in the fading light of day, cold but upright, bundle in hand, remember that history often hides in such moments. Moments soak through. Moments rewritten not by pen, but by persistence. And the river? It keeps flowing. Indifferent, but not untouched. For it once bore the shape of a woman who refused to turn back. The pilgrim who carried a heavy relic the whole journey. Imagine yourself on a long, stony path winding through a patchwork of fields and low, wooded ridges. The wind is steady and cool, brushing gently across your face as you walk. The sky overhead is a muted gray, the kind that promises neither rain nor sun. Along the road ahead, a lone figure moves at a slow, deliberate pace. His cloak is worn thin at the shoulders. A carved wooden casket is bound tightly to his chest, pressing against his ribs with each breath. He does not complain. He does not stop. He is a pilgrim, and what he carries is not food or coin, but something far older, far heavier in meaning. A small reliquary, no larger than a loaf of bread, containing a sacred fragment said to belong to a long-dead saint. A piece of bone, perhaps, or a sliver of cloth. Its exact contents have been lost to time, but its purpose has not. To this man, it was both burden and blessing. His name is not preserved in church record or monastic scroll. Like so many pilgrims of the late Middle Ages, he was likely illiterate and unnamed in official histories. But oral traditions and regional chronicles offer glimpses. References to a man who traveled hundreds of miles on foot from Lincolnshire to Canterbury, carrying a relic not for personal gain, but for penance, or perhaps for thanks. In the 14th century, relics were believed to be imbued with holy power. They were not simply remnants of saints, they were vessels of divine presence. To carry one on pilgrimage was to invite blessing, but also to accept responsibility. Such a journey was not symbolic alone. It was physical, often grueling. The relic this pilgrim carried was bound in a carved oak container, sealed with beeswax and lead inlays. Relics were not to be handled casually. Many were kept in shrines or under altar stones, locked away and rarely seen. For a layman to travel with one was unusual. It suggested trust or desperation. Local tradition says the man had lost someone to illness, a wife or child perhaps, and had vowed to carry the relic to the shrine of St. Thomas Becket in Canterbury as a promise kept. Each day, he walked with a box strapped tight to his chest with linen wraps and leather cord. He did not place it in a cart. He did not sling it from his side. He bore it like a shield, across his heart. Imagine the pressure that would create. Not only the physical ache, a slow bruising against the sternum, the rubbing of straps across bone, but the weight of meaning. Every step was a kind of prayer. Every hill, a test of faith. And though others on the road might carry packs or staffs, he carried a fragment of the sacred, and with it, the hopes or guilt that had led him to begin. By the third week, his shoulders were raw beneath the linen. The bindings had rubbed the skin until it blistered. Still, he refused to let the casket out of his sight. At night, he slept with it clutched tight beneath his cloak. At stream crossings, he lifted it high above the water. When invited to share lodging in monasteries or barns, he asked only for a dry corner, and sometimes even declined food if he felt it would slow his penance. He was not alone on the roads. The 14th century saw a rise in pilgrimage, especially after the waves of plague and famine had left people searching for meaning. The road to Canterbury was well worn, marked by carved stones and resting shrines. But most pilgrims traveled light. They prayed, they sang, they shared meals and slept in groups. This man did not. He was courteous, but distant, focused. Pilgrimage for him was not escape. It was offering. By the time he reached the outskirts of Canterbury, witnesses say his clothing had worn thin at the shoulders. His boots had split at the seams. He walked with a slow limp, though not from injury. It was the posture of someone protecting something fragile and vital. At the gate, he was asked if he required aid. He bowed and said only, "Not until I lay it down." Inside the cathedral, pilgrims would often light candles, touch the shrine of Becket, or offer gifts in exchange for prayers. But this man made no requests. He asked only that the relic be received in silence, and that no one open it. Some say he left it at the foot of the altar, bowed, and walked away. Others say he wept as he unfastened the leather cord for the first time in weeks. Either way, once the box was no longer pressed to his chest, he did not speak again. The relic itself was later stored in the cathedral's lower sacristy. Its origins unknown, its story carried by word of mouth, preserved in fragments. There is something quieting in imagining such a man. His journey wasn't loud. There were no miracles, no visions, no conversions. Just one man, walking day after day, with pain as his companion and faith as his tether. He chose burden as devotion, and in that choice, found a rhythm to carry him forward. Pilgrimage in the medieval world was not always about destination. It was often about transformation through discomfort. To choose a long road, to endure it without reward. This was a form of purification, or remembrance, a way to make peace with something too large to carry inside the mind alone. We remember stories like this not because they are grand, but because they reveal what quiet persistence can look like. The man with the relic did not change history, but he walked through it. And in doing so, he left behind more than just footprints. He left a shape of longing, of commitment, of humility. And perhaps that's what relics truly are. Not just objects of the sacred, but the stories we bind to them. Stories that, like the pilgrim's path, wear slowly into the stone, and remain long after we are gone. The miller's son who took ill from foul water. Imagine a quiet, dusty road winding through the countryside in late summer. The grass is faded, the soil dry beneath brittle leaves. Cicadas hum in the distance, their drone steady and hypnotic. Not far from the path lies a stagnant pond, still and murky, its edges curled with algae, its surface glinting faintly beneath the sun. A young man kneels beside it, his face flushed from travel, his lips cracked from thirst. He knows better. Everyone knows not to drink from standing water. But the heat presses down like a weight, and there is no stream in sight. He drinks. By evening, the fever has set in. This was the fate of the miller's son. Young, alone, and far from home. His journey was meant to be simple, perhaps even hopeful. Some accounts describe him as a novice pilgrim, headed toward a local shrine. Others suggest he was simply running an errand, delivering grain or seeking work. What unites all versions of the story is this: he drank from a bad source, and the consequences came swiftly. In the medieval world, water could heal or kill. Springs were revered for their purity. Shrines were built over wells believed to cure blindness, fever, or madness. But in contrast, stagnant water was a threat known by nearly all. Lacking our modern understanding of bacteria, people associated foul water with rot, sin, or miasma, bad air thought to rise from decaying matter. A still pond, especially one warm and shallow, was seen as risky. It might have been tainted by animals, waste, or simply too long untouched by wind or flow. For the miller's son, the signs of sickness came quickly. Chills despite the heat, shaking hands, a sharp ache behind the eyes, perhaps vomiting, perhaps a slow drift into confusion. With no healer nearby and no family to speak for him, he collapsed near the roadside. That is where fellow travelers found him, curled against a tree, murmuring words no one could quite make out. He did not die that day. Instead, he lingered, silent, sweating, barely conscious. For days, he lay there, half wrapped in a tattered cloak, watched by pilgrims who passed and paused. Some left bread, others soaked cloth in cool water and pressed it to his brow. No one stayed long. Fear followed illness like a shadow in those days. They had seen fevers before, some ordinary, others deadly, and with little way to distinguish between them, kindness was tempered by caution. Even simple sicknesses could spiral. A stomach illness, if severe, might weaken someone beyond recovery. Dehydration, especially under a hot sun, could kill in hours. And infectious disease was a constant, shape-shifting threat. Medieval people did not know the names, dysentery, cholera, typhoid, but they recognized the symptoms. Sudden illness, foul-smelling breath, strange discoloration. They knew these things meant danger. Still, the road itself became a kind of community. Pilgrims, merchants, beggars, laborers, they all shared the same paths, the same weather, the same vulnerabilities. And for a brief time, the miller's son became part of this quiet, shifting network of strangers. His presence was marked not by words, but by the small acts of those who came by. Someone moving him into shade, another leaving a pouch of herbs, a third mumbling a prayer while keeping a wide distance. He likely wore simple clothes, a rough tunic, worn boots, perhaps a small satchel that had long since been rifled through by wind and weather. The son of a miller would have known hard work. His hands would have been calloused from lifting sacks of flour or turning heavy wooden wheels. And yet, there he lay, unmoving, surrounded by nothing but dust and silence. There's no record of how long he remained like this. Some say 3 days. Others stretch it to a week. In some versions of the story, he recovers, weak but alive, helped to his feet by an old woman who shared a tincture made from willow bark. In others, he simply fades, another soul laid to rest beside the road, his passing noted only by a cross of sticks pressed into the dirt. Stories like his were not uncommon. Medieval roadsides were not just routes between places. They were stages for countless personal dramas, brief, wordless, and forgotten. Illness, birth, arguments, reunions, all could unfold along the path. Without inns at every mile or hospitals nearby, people made do. And in doing so, they formed a web of quiet witness. A sort of moving village with no boundaries and no fixed members. Medieval texts occasionally mention such figures. A youth struck with sudden fever. A stranger lying beneath the oak. A boy of no parish found near the bend. They are footnotes in larger chronicles, but each represents a life, and the way it brushed against others before vanishing. Sometimes, after the fever lifted, the traveler would return home with a new reverence. Other times, the name would be passed only in whispers. The miller's boy who drank from the pond. One can imagine how the story changed in telling. In some villages, he became a warning. Don't drink still water, or you'll end up like him. In others, he was remembered more gently. A boy who tried to keep going, even when his strength gave out. And then, gradually, even those whispers faded. Still, his story lingers, not because of any great act or dramatic ending, but because it captures the fragile thread that once tethered each life to health, to chance, to the kindness of strangers. It reminds us that long ago, even a single sip of water could shape a fate. So when you think of the past, not the castles or wars, but the real lives lived quietly between. Picture him, a boy of rough hands and hopeful steps, felled not by sword or storm, but by thirst. And for a time, tended only by the passing world, the pilgrim who crossed the mountains in a snowstorm. Imagine yourself at the base of a mountain pass as the first snow of late autumn begins to fall. The air is thin, tinged with the sharp scent of cold stone and pine. Each breath is visible, drifting away before being swept up by the wind. You listen, a hollow sound as it rushes through the rocks, carrying with it the memory of all who have climbed before you. For one medieval pilgrim, the journey began with hope and ended with endurance. His route, charted more by story than by map, was said to be direct but unforgiving. The mountain pass stood as both a gateway and a barrier, ancient, indifferent, and always unpredictable as the seasons turned. He left the foothills at dawn, his pack heavy with bread, dried beans, and a length of woolen cloth. The village behind him faded into fog. By midday, snow began to fall. At first a dusting, then a steady curtain that blurred the trail and muffled every sound. As he climbed, drifts formed quickly, sometimes reaching above his knees. The familiar path vanished, leaving only the faint memory of stories told by other travelers. Look for the leaning pine near the ridge, follow the curve of the frozen stream. Never rest for too long. Medieval mountain crossings were feats of ordinary persistence, not heroics. Most who braved them did so out of necessity, traders, herders, or those seeking sanctuary on the other side. Pilgrims, in particular, were a common sight in the high passes, moving slowly, step by step, trusting that the journey itself was as meaningful as the shrine ahead. Winter arrived early in the mountains. In the valleys, there might still be green, but here, the world narrowed to rock, wind, and snow. Boots grew heavy, their leather stiffening in the cold. Fingers numbed even inside thick mittens. The pilgrim moved with deliberation, stopping only to adjust the scarf across his face or to knock snow from his shoulders. Each footfall became a small decision. Where to step, where to avoid, how to keep balance when the earth slipped beneath layers of ice. He passed landmarks that now seemed strange, distorted by the storm. The pine tree others had mentioned leaned at an odd angle, its lower branches heavy with ice. The stream, remembered as a ribbon of blue in summer, was now hidden beneath drifts, only occasionally betraying itself as the snow gave way to a dark, cold trickle. Stories told him he was on the right path, but sight alone could not confirm it. There is a particular kind of silence in the mountains during snow. It is neither peaceful nor ominous, but something between. A hush that absorbs the small sounds of life and amplifies the pulse in your ears. The pilgrim paused at intervals, listening for anything that might break the monotony. a distant bell, the call of a bird, perhaps even another traveler. But there was only wind. In medieval times, such crossings carried risks that were quietly accepted. Many did not speak of the dangers, but everyone knew them. Avalanches, sudden storms, frostbite, and exhaustion. It was not uncommon for villages to light lamps or ring bells at twilight, hoping to guide home those still out on the slopes. Stories told of wanderers who followed a distant light, thinking it led to shelter, only to find themselves further from safety. The pilgrim pressed on, guided now by the rhythm of his own steps and the persistence of memory. He recalled a story. Somewhere near the highest point, the rocks would form a kind of gate, two pillars close enough to touch with outstretched arms. If you passed between them, it meant you were more than halfway. When he finally found the pillars, coated in ice, almost invisible except for their shape, he allowed himself a brief moment to rest, leaning into the wind's push. Hunger became a background presence, quiet and insistent. He chewed a piece of bread, its texture brittle from the cold. Water came from melted snow, scooped into a tin cup and warmed in his hands. He did not linger. The snow kept falling, relentless and impersonal, blurring the line between earth and sky. Toward dusk the slope eased. The wind softened. Far below, a ribbon of smoke rose from a valley hamlet, a sign of shelter, warmth, and the end of ordeal. The last descent was careful, cautious. He checked every step, knowing the day's exhaustion made mistakes easy. When he reached the village, the locals brought him inside. They did not ask many questions. It was enough to see a traveler safe from the pass. He warmed himself by a fire, steam rising from his boots. The stories he had followed, half memory, half hope, had been enough. In the days to come, he would continue his pilgrimage. But he would always remember the mountains in snow, the hush, the blindness, the small landmarks that mattered more than any map. He had crossed alone, but not unguided. Every step was part of a rhythm, a tradition older than any single traveler. And in the memory of that cold, in the gentleness of survival, he joined all those who had ever walked where only snow and silence kept watch. The tinker who was robbed of every possession. Imagine yourself waking before sunrise, dew still clinging to the grass, the air cool and still. Somewhere not far from a narrow road, a man stirs beside a hedgerow. His name is lost to time. A tinker, a traveling mender of pots and pans, accustomed to the long silence of the road. His pack, once heavy with the tools of his trade, is gone. So are his coins, his spare shirt, even his food. All that remains are the clothes on his back and a worn wooden staff. This is the morning after everything changed. The journey had begun as many did in his world, with careful packing and a mental tally of villages to visit. Tinkers traveled light, but not empty-handed. His pack had held pliers, tiny hammers, lengths of wire, and perhaps a battered tin whistle for company. He had food, coarse bread, a lump of cheese, maybe a few dried apples. By the third week, the road felt familiar. The rhythm of his boots, the gentle sway of hedges, the distant smell of earth and smoke from farmsteads. He was used to hardship, but not to being utterly emptied. Bandits came at dawn, as the world was only beginning to color. There were no shouts, no struggle worth recording. Perhaps 3 men, faces shadowed by hoods, voices low and efficient. They did not linger. What little he carried was swiftly stripped away, leaving him only with his patched tunic, worn trousers, and staff. By the time the light strengthened and birds began to sing, he was alone once more, wealthless in every visible way. The medieval world did not offer comfort to the dispossessed. There were no police to file a report with, no social safety net, no surety that justice would ever touch the men who had taken his tools. For a tinker, tools were livelihood. Without them, there was little to trade, little reason for villagers to invite him to mend kettles or sharpen knives. Yet the rhythm of the road pressed onward, and so did he. Imagine the first hours after such loss. Hunger sharpened awareness. Every bird call and every snapping twig in the brush seemed louder, as if the world itself was alert to his new vulnerability. The staff, once just a walking aid, became something to lean on, something to grasp in case of trouble. With no coin, he could not buy bread from passing farmers. Without tools, he could not barter for a corner of a barn to sleep in. Still he walked. Nights became the true test. He searched for shelter where he could. A copse of trees, the lee side of a hayrick, the back wall of a ruined chapel. The world after dark was colder, and the thin cloth of his tunic did little to hold warmth. Hunger crept in, a slow gnawing presence. He might have chewed wild sorrel or nibbled hawthorn berries when he found them. Their tartness both comfort and reminder of how much he had lost. Yet, as the days unfolded, he continued. This was not stubbornness, exactly, but necessity. The medieval poor knew little of safety. Every day was a negotiation between what could be endured and what could not. The tinker kept to the road. He avoided large towns where he would be chased away for having nothing to offer. Instead, he skirted small villages, sometimes waiting for dusk to slip to the edge of a yard and ask quietly for a crust of bread or a drink of water. There was, even in hardship, a rhythm to the days. Sunrise brought birdsong and the distant clatter of farm tools. Mornings were for walking, following paths worn down by centuries of feet. Occasionally, a farmer might offer a word or even a scrap of news about wolves seen in the north woods or a lord's men seeking laborers for the fields. Afternoons were warmer, the sun sometimes heavy on his back, sweat prickling beneath his collar. He moved slowly, never hurrying, for there was nowhere he could rush to. He may have recalled, on these long walks, the times before. The feel of metal in his hands, the way villagers greeted him by name, the pleasure of fixing a pan so cleanly that it shone. Memory, in the absence of comfort, can be both friend and torment. He would have missed his whistle, the way it broke the monotony of travel. He would have missed the small satisfaction of trading a mended hinge for a handful of beans. Still, he pressed on. The social fabric of the medieval countryside was thin but not absent. Some villagers distrusted wanderers, seeing in every stranger a threat or a burden. Others, remembering their own brushes with misfortune, offered what little they could. A stale crust, a turnip, a place beside the kitchen fire for an hour. It was never certain. Each encounter was a risk, weighed against the necessity of survival. With nothing left to lose, the tinker learned again the lesson every traveler faces: that hardship shapes both the road and the traveler. Hunger blurs the edges of days, turning hope into something smaller and quieter. The sky above, unchanged by his loss, remained vast and unmoved. The land pressed on around him, fields tilled, sheep grazing, distant bells marking hours he could no longer measure by comfort or routine. By the time he reached the next town or shrine, he would have been changed, not only thinner, but quieter, more inward. The absence of belongings is not only a physical lack, but a softening of the self, a stripping away of pride and certainty. What mattered became clear: warmth, a crust of bread, the shelter of a stone wall, a moment's safety. In this, the tinker was not alone. Many on the roads of medieval Europe lost what little they had to bandits, disease, or simple misfortune. Their stories rarely made the chronicles. No songs were sung for them, no statues raised. Yet they endured, step by step, learning to make peace with less, and to find, in the thinness of the world, a quiet kind of strength. So, as the sun sets on another empty evening, you might imagine him curled beneath a hedge, staff clutched loosely, eyes closing against the long, uncertain dark. There is no triumph, no sudden rescue. Only the slow persistence of another day survived, and the hope, however faint, that tomorrow might bring something lost, Or perhaps something unexpected and new. The woman who walked miles on an injured foot. Imagine a narrow dirt track winding through rolling hills, the morning mist still clinging softly to grass and thorny bushes. Along this path moves a solitary woman, her steps uneven and cautious. With each footfall, she shifts her weight carefully, trying to avoid placing pressure on her injured heel. The pain is dull but persistent, a bruised stone lodged beneath skin that is tender and swollen. Yet she walks on. Injuries like hers were common among medieval travelers. Roads were rough and often strewn with loose stones, sharp roots, or hidden debris. Few wore sturdy shoes. Many relied on simple leather or even traveled barefoot. Protective footwear was a luxury, and even when available, it offered limited defense against the harshness of the road. The bruise on her heel may have come from a single misstep. A loose cobble, a pointed rock in a shallow stream bed, or a hidden thorn pressed deep with the weight of her stride. Regardless of its cause, the injury made every step a test of endurance. Yet, stopping was not an option. The path she followed led to a distant village, a market, or perhaps a sanctuary. She may have been carrying goods to sell, seeking medical aid, or simply trying to reach family before nightfall. Time and purpose did not bend easily for pain. Travelers who met her along the way noticed. Some slowed, exchanging quiet glances of concern. A few offered water, or a whispered blessing. Others kept pace at a distance, neither wanting to intrude nor able to help. Their looks were a mixture of admiration and pity, recognition of the quiet strength it took to keep moving despite discomfort. Medieval society often regarded such perseverance as a virtue. Suffering was intertwined with faith, humility, and honor. To continue walking when the body cried out was to demonstrate a kind of inner resolve that marked the difference between mere travel and pilgrimage, between hardship endured and weakness surrendered. Her limping gait would have been familiar to those who regularly journeyed by foot. Merchants, pilgrims, peasants moving between fields and villages. They all knew the ache of twisted ankles, bruised heels, and blistered soles. The road was a constant companion of pain, yet also a place of connection. Passing a stranger meant sharing a nod, a greeting, or sometimes a tale of endurance. As the sun climbed higher, the warmth helped ease the stiffness in her joints, but also dried the sweat that dampened her brow. Dust rose in soft clouds with every step, settling on her worn cloak and the bundle she carried. The scent of dry earth mixed with a faint aroma of wildflowers growing along the roadside, offering small comfort amid discomfort. At times, she stopped briefly, resting on a fallen log or leaning against a rough tree trunk. She flexed her foot gingerly, mindful not to aggravate the injury. Her breath came steady but labored, and then, gathering strength, she rose and continued, each step measured but resolute. It is unlikely that anyone recorded her name, or her story in chronicles or court records, but moments like hers were countless across the medieval landscape. Silent acts of perseverance that stitched together the fabric of daily life. This woman's journey teaches us about the rhythm of hardship and hope, about the way pain can shape the pace of life without halting it entirely, and about how ordinary lives, though often unremarked, carry within them extraordinary quiet strength. So now, as you imagine her limping along that winding path, feel the texture of the dirt beneath her feet, the weight of the bundle at her side, and the stubborn ache that refuses to let her rest. Hear the soft rustle of leaves and the distant call of a bird, steady and unhurried, just like her steps. In that gentle persistence lies a story not of triumph or tragedy, but of a human spirit moving forward, one painful step at a time. The pilgrim who slept in a barn with strangers. Imagine yourself nearing the end of a long day's walk. The sky dims to soft shades of blue and gray, and the evening chill settles gently over the landscape. You come upon a small village, its houses clustered close and smoke rising faintly from chimneys. Your feet ache from the miles of uneven road. Your pack heavy on your back, your hands cold and stiff. You seek shelter. For pilgrims in medieval England, the journey was as much about the kindness of strangers as it was about reaching holy shrines. Inns and hostels existed, but many were expensive or full, so the worn and weary often found themselves at the mercy of village goodwill, or the lack of it. It was common to ask for lodging in barns or outbuildings, places where animals and hay were kept, but that offered some protection from the elements. One such pilgrim, a man whose name is lost, but whose story survives in the oral traditions of a small Suffolk village, found himself welcomed into a barn on a chilly autumn evening. The air inside was thick with the scent of dried hay, mingled faintly with the musk of livestock. The walls were wooden planks, the floor uneven and dusty. Yet here was shelter from the cold, and a flickering candlelight cast long shadows on rough beams. Inside, a handful of strangers gathered, travelers like himself, or perhaps villagers who came to warm themselves by the fire after a day's labor. They shared what little they had, a crust of hard bread, some cheese, and stories passed quietly in low voices. Tales of saints and miracles, of lost loves and long roads. The pilgrim listened, feeling the fragile warmth of fellowship settle around him like a thin blanket. In those moments, the barn was more than a shelter. It was a small refuge from the hardships of the road. The tired voices wove a thread of connection, a temporary community bound not by blood or rank, but by shared vulnerability. The pilgrim's eyes grew heavy. The scent of hay, the murmur of voices, and the steady breathing of others nearby soon lulled him to sleep. But morning did not bring comfort. He awoke to cold light slipping through the cracks in the barn walls. The strangers had gone, and with them his few coins, his last means to buy food or passage. The crust of bread was gone too, eaten in the night. The warmth that had seemed so real was replaced by the chill of empty pockets and solitude. This story, simple and unadorned, reflects a common reality for many who traveled medieval roads. The roads were filled with uncertainty. Not everyone who offered shelter did so with kindness. Pilgrims were vulnerable, sometimes seen as easy marks or burdens. Trust was a currency as fragile as the coins in one's pouch. Yet, the pilgrim continued. There was no turning back, no choice but to press forward. His experience in that barn became a silent lesson, a reminder of the fragility of human kindness, and the resilience required to walk through the world relying on it. The barn itself, long since gone, was likely a typical medieval structure. Timber framed with thatched roofing, open beams, and hay stored in piles that cushioned the cold stone floor. It smelled of earth and animals, and sometimes of sweat and dust. It was not comfortable, but it was shelter. In such places, the lines between human and animal, stranger and friend, blurred for a night. Stories like this endure not because of grand adventure or heroic deeds, but because they capture the rhythm of real life on the road. They remind us that pilgrimage was as much about endurance and caution as about faith and hope. In the quiet aftermath, the pilgrim had only his steps and his resolve. Each morning, as the sun rose over fields still damp with dew, he set out again, footsteps tracing the worn paths pilgrims had traveled for centuries. The barn and its vanished company became part of his story, a chapter marked by the scent of hay and the cold bite of reality. And as with many such moments, it was not the loss that defined him, but his choice to continue, alone, wary but unbroken. The mason who took vows of silence and solitude. Imagine a narrow forest path, dappled by soft sunlight filtering through ancient branches. The air carries the faint scent of pine and damp earth. Along this quiet trail walks a man alone, steady and deliberate. His steps are sure but unhurried. His eyes, rarely meeting another's, seem to hold a world apart. He speaks no word. His silence is absolute. This is the mason who took vows of silence and solitude, a figure both mysterious and familiar in medieval history. His choice was unusual, yet not unheard of. Among the many spiritual practices of the Middle Ages, silence was often embraced as a path toward inner clarity and divine connection. For some, it was a form of penance, for others a calling. Masons occupied a unique place in medieval society. Skilled artisans, they shaped the stone that formed cathedrals, bridges, and castles, the very monuments of their time. Their craft required focus, patience, and physical strength. Yet, beyond the rhythmic chisel and hammer, some masons sought a different kind of work, the shaping of their own souls. Our mason's vow of silence may have begun as a private decision, perhaps guided by a spiritual advisor or monk. It meant abstaining not only from speech, but often from unnecessary social contact. His solitude was both a shield and a statement. In a world filled with noise, the clang of smithies, the chatter of markets, the prayers of crowded churches, his silence set him apart. When travelers and villagers encountered him, they noted his reserved manner. Offered food or assistance, he accepted with a simple nod or a faint gesture, but never replied. Some thought his silence was born of pride, a deliberate withdrawal from worldly affairs. Others believed he was holy, a man so devoted to God that human words had become distractions. This silence shaped his journey as much as the miles beneath his feet. Where others walked in groups or at least exchanged greetings, he moved alone. Nights were spent beneath open skies or in sparse shelters, his presence as quiet as the stars overhead. His companions were shadows and wind, his prayers spoken only in the stillness of his heart. Historical records hint at such individuals, though details are often scarce. Monastic writings sometimes mention hermits or silent pilgrims whose austerity was both admired and feared. In some cases, these vows were temporary, a season of quiet before rejoining community life. For others, like this mason, the silence stretched on, becoming the defining feature of their existence. His craft, too, was entwined with his solitude. Stonework demands precision and calm, qualities nurtured in silence. Perhaps his hands shaped blocks for a distant abbey, or carved intricate capitals for a church nave. Each chisel stroke was a word unspoken, each tower stone a sentence of devotion. Yet isolation carried its costs. Without the warmth of conversation, loneliness could seep deep. Without shared stories or laughter, time stretched endlessly. Villagers sometimes pitied him, but he did not seek pity. He seemed content in his chosen solitude, as if the silence offered answers the world could not. Occasionally, a stranger might attempt to break through his quietude with a question or a blessing. He would respond only with a steady gaze or a humble bow. It was said that his eyes, though calm, held ancient sorrows or profound peace, perhaps both intertwined. His journey lasted longer than most pilgrimages. While others might have crossed regions or kingdoms in weeks or months, his path was measured in silence and solitude. An inward pilgrimage as much as an outward one. No matter how far he walked, the true distance was in the depths he traversed within himself. Eventually, like many who live apart, his story faded into whispers. Some claimed he disappeared into the mountains, becoming one with the wild. Others said he settled in a remote hermitage, where only birds and stone bore witness. No monuments mark his name. No songs were sung. Only the faint echo of his footsteps lingers along the paths he chose. In the end, the mason's vow was less about renouncing the world, and more about finding a sacred space within it. A quiet that held meaning beyond speech. A solitude that shaped both stone and soul. So as you imagine the past, not in loud battles or grand speeches, but in moments of stillness, picture him, the mason who walked alone, who spoke not a word, and whose silence built a bridge between earth and eternity. the elderly nun who tended the sick along the road. Imagine an early morning along a quiet medieval road, the world hushed beneath a mist that clings to fields and hedgerows. The sun is only a pale suggestion on the horizon, and the air carries the chill of another night passed beneath open sky. A small figure moves along the path, her steps measured, her habit patched and faded from many seasons' travel. She carries a cloth bundle and the slow, patient rhythm of someone who has walked this way many times before. She is an elderly nun. Her name, perhaps forgotten by history, but not her presence. Her story is not one of grand miracles or recorded sainthood, but of persistence, quiet mercy, and the daily, unremarkable acts of kindness that once formed the backbone of communal life. Her journey, like that of many pilgrims and mendicants, was meant to lead her to a distant shrine. But unlike most, she traveled with no fixed schedule. Instead, she let the needs of others set her pace. Along the medieval roads, the sick and the poor were never far away. Bandaged feet, hollow cheeks, shivering bodies huddled by hedges or crouched in the shade of ruined milestones. For every grand procession of nobles or merchants, there were dozens more who limped along in silence, hoping only for rest and relief. It was among these that the elderly nun felt most at home. Whenever she came upon someone in need, a feverish child, a man with a festering wound, a mother clutching a frail infant, she would stop, kneeling beside them as if time itself would wait for this moment. Her hands, though stiff with age, were practiced. She carried scraps of linen, a flask of weak wine, and a small pouch of dried herbs, sage for cleansing, comfrey for binding, thyme for coughs. She would soak cloth in the wine, cleaning wounds with gentle patience, or press a handful of herbs into trembling hands. Sometimes she gave away her own food, half a coarse loaf, a few dried figs, the last strip of salt pork she had saved for the next day. When supplies ran out, she went hungry herself, trusting the kindness of others or the bounty of the roadside. Wild garlic, nettles, and berries, until she could find more. The roads themselves were often harsh and indifferent. Mud pooled in deep ruts, and the air was thick with the scent of smoke from distant hearths. Yet even as the days grew shorter and the nights colder, she kept to her steady pace. Pilgrims might overtake her, merchants pass by in noisy wagons, but she pressed on without complaint. The rhythm of her walk became a form of prayer, a slow, unbroken offering of her remaining strength to those she met. Monastic women in the medieval world often played a quiet but vital role in the care of the sick. While great hospitals existed in some cities, most villages relied on the knowledge and charity of nuns, widows, and wise women. Their medicine was simple but rooted in experience. Balms made from lard and beeswax, teas of elderflower or chamomile, the soothing touch of a cool cloth. The elderly nun was part of this tradition, a living link in a chain of care that stretched from one generation to the next. Her journey was marked not by the milestones she passed, but by the people she left behind. Each one patched up, comforted, or fed, each a small pause in the steady flow of travelers. She lost track of time. Days blurred into weeks, the seasons shifted, and still she moved onward. Sometimes, she would reach a crossroads and find herself without clear direction, relying on memory, the advice of villagers, or the faded marks scratched into roadside stones. At night, she sometimes slept in the shelter of an old barn, sometimes beneath the branches of a wayside tree. She would wake early, stiff and cold, but grateful for another day's light. In her prayers, she asked not for strength or reward, but for the patience to keep going, for the chance to ease just one more person's suffering. When at last she arrived at her destination, a modest shrine in a distant town, she had nothing left but the habit she wore. Her bundle was empty, her food long since given away, her hands still marked by the work of bandaging and washing. The warden at the shrine greeted her with surprise, for word of her kindness had traveled ahead. other pilgrims had spoken of the elderly nun who stopped for the sick and the hungry, delaying her own arrival by weeks so that others might have comfort. She knelt before the altar, not with pride or expectation, but with a quiet relief. Her journey had taken far longer than planned, but she did not regret a single delay. In her passing, she left a faint trail of kindness, a memory carried in the stories told by those she helped, in the small comforts she gave without thought for herself. History rarely records such lives in detail. Yet, in the calm that followed her journey, she joined the countless nameless souls who shaped their world not with grand gestures, but with 1,000 simple acts of care along the road. The pilgrim who returned home without ever reaching the shrine. Imagine the long shadow of a man cast by the evening sun, trudging slowly along a winding road. His pack is light, shoulders hunched not just from weight, but from months of walking. The village he left behind months earlier is a memory shaped by distance and longing. Fields have blurred into forests, roads into muddy tracks, familiar faces into the silent company of strangers. And now, just as the journey nears its end, when the towers or the faint shimmer of the holy shrine are at last within sight, his body fails him. He was a pilgrim, one among many who crossed medieval Europe's rutted byways in hope of healing, forgiveness, or grace. Such journeys were not rare, though for most, the thought of leaving home for months on end was daunting. The decision to go was often driven by a vow, a promise made in illness, grief, or gratitude. Sometimes it was made on behalf of another. A child born sickly, a harvest ruined, a sin weighing heavily on the soul. Pilgrims set out not with certainty of return, but with faith that every step was a prayer in motion. His journey began much like others, with blessings from neighbors, a hurried meal, a handful of coins pressed into his palm. Provisions were meager, but so too were expectations. Pilgrimage was not meant to be comfortable. The road offered hardship and risk in equal measure. Rain-soaked days could last for weeks. Feet blistered and boots wore thin. Along the way, he joined and left company with other travelers, sometimes walking with those who shared his purpose, sometimes alone but for the sound of distant bells or his own steady breath. The road itself was both teacher and test. Inns were few and expensive, and the food they served could be as meager as the cold bread he carried. More often, he slept in barns, under hedges, or in the corners of chapels where hospitality was offered, if not warmth. Hunger was a constant companion. Thirst another. Yet the hope of reaching the shrine, of touching the relics and whispering a prayer in their presence, kept him moving forward. As the journey stretched from weeks into months, the landscape changed. He passed through market towns where the language shifted and customs grew strange. He crossed bridges marked with the offerings of other pilgrims, shells, tokens, or scraps of cloth tied to railings in hope or in thanks. Each mile left its mark. His hands grew leaner, his cheeks hollowed, his stride slower. Then, when the end was finally near, when the distant spires or the first sight of pilgrims returning from the shrine appeared, his strength deserted him. A cough, perhaps, that had lingered too long. A fever that burned through sleep. Illness was not a rare visitor on the road, but this time it would not be shaken off. He tried to continue, one slow step at a time, but each day brought less distance than the one before, until at last he could go no further. It was a passing merchant who found him, a man accustomed to the risks and unpredictability of the open road. Perhaps he recognized the signs of a failed journey. The way the pilgrim's eyes lingered on the horizon, the way he clutched his staff, the quiet defeat in his posture. There was no shame in turning back. The road was littered with abandoned hopes. Still, the merchant took pity, offering a seat on his cart, a blanket, a sip of watered wine. They turned for home. The return was quieter, marked not by the anticipation of arrival, but by a slow reckoning. He had not reached the shrine. He had not touched the relics, or completed the rituals he had imagined so often on sleepless nights. Yet, the journey itself had changed him. Days on the road had stripped away the comforts of home, but also the burdens he had carried. There was no sense of triumph, but neither was there shame. Back in his village, his story became something quietly revered. Neighbors gathered to listen, not to tales of miracles or treasures, but to the shape of the journey itself. The long hours on foot, the nights spent beneath strange skies, the kindness of strangers, the courage required to leave, and the wisdom to return. Some believe that the shrine's blessing was not reserved only for those who reached its doors, but also for those who had the humility to know their limits. Medieval society understood unfinished stories. Not all fields yielded harvest. Not all children grew to adulthood. Not all vows were fulfilled as planned. Yet the act of setting out, of striving towards something greater, was worthy of respect. The return of a pilgrim, changed by hardship and experience, was not a failure but a lesson, woven quietly into the community's memory. Imagine him sitting beside the fire in his own cottage, the familiar scent of peat and herbs in the air, the rough wool of his blanket, the soft murmur of voices outside, the distant clatter of a pot on the hearth. He may have felt sorrow for what was left undone, but also relief, a slow settling into the rhythm of daily life, now measured not by miles but by the turning of seasons, the comfort of known faces. His pilgrimage became a story told with gentleness, a reminder that not every journey ends as planned, and not every goal is reached in the way one expects. For those who listened, especially on long winter evenings, the tale offered something to hold on to, that the worth of a journey is not measured only by its destination, but by the courage to begin, the grace to endure, and the wisdom to return when needed. Let the story end there, softly, as the fire burns low and the village settles for the night. Let the quiet persistence of the pilgrim's footsteps fade into memory. A lesson, a comfort, a gentle echo of how far one can travel, even when the journey remains unfinished.